So in terms of my paper, I was looking recently at kind of online chatter amongst far-right extremist groups, and looking at kind of key trends in relation to this. Particularly, we've seen a lot of, as Maddie alludes to, a lot of talk around it, maybe some moral panics around the use of this technology. So I wanted to have a bit of an exploratory look at some of the ways that UK far-right extremists talk about this on their channels, specifically on Telegram. So this was released earlier as a longer form kind of GNet piece. So if you want to read more, then it's up on the GNet website. So in terms of the far right and its use of internet, I think it's just good to contextualize this. So we've obviously seen quite a large number of attacks with a similar script committed by far right extremists in the past 4 or 5 years, particularly 2019 being a kind of zenith year in terms of fatalities and attacks, but also a long tail of kind of copycat incidences. And these have been largely facilitated through online subcultures and also dissemination of propaganda by right-wing lone actors. But in terms of the groups themselves, what we've seen is quite a key shift, which is from looking at more kind of throwing kind of propaganda out there in terms of monologic kind of focus to ones that's more dialogic in terms of trying to facilitate discussions with unaligned actors, as well as using more kind of coded themes around tradition, heritage, civilization, in order to kind of attract new recruits, and also a more transnational form of activism. I mean, pre-internet, we did see that happening amongst kind of parties and movements, especially in the third wave of far extremism, within the Front National being a very kind of prominent inspiration for a lot of groups and actors. But we've seen really kind of explosion in this in more recent years. So in terms of the far right's use of the kind of AI, we've seen potentials here in terms of propaganda, so the use of large language models in order to kind of scaffold and create that. Potentials here in terms of maybe deep fakes amongst terrorist and extremist users, maybe jumping off from the far right, maybe looking at kind of key jihadi figures and using AI in relation to that, and also in terms of disinformation, misinformation. Also, in terms of recruitment, we can think about the use of maybe chatbots in order to speak to non-aligned people and to really amplify and kind of disseminate the messages of these groups. And then finally, at the harder end, considerations here in terms of kinetic attacks. So, for example, the use of maybe kind of AI in terms of generating code then might be weaponized from using, for example, drones, or also maybe 3D printing of weapons. And we can also think about this being a very easy reach for terrorist actors to generate kind of content in terms of manifestos, maybe after to disseminate after an attack. So in terms of the study itself, this was an exploratory qualitative content as well as sentiment analysis. And I tried to get a good representation of key far-right groups in the UK. So I looked at groups that were more avowedly kind of white nationalist in kind of sentiment than the more kind of ethnically nationalist identitarian side of the far-right spectrum, Identity England, and also those at the more culturally nationalist kind of anti-Islam, kind of more perhaps quote unquote mainstream ends in terms of Britain First. And what I was keen was to think about not just how they were talking about using artificial intelligence, but how they evaluated it within their discourse and the extent to which it connected with their kind of core ideological claims around sort of anti-immigration, white kind of marginalization, white genocide is a term, a conspiracy that they often use, or whether it kind of tapped into more emerging populist kind of themes around kind of anti-government or anti-liberal kind of sentiment within these groups. So in terms of the findings, what was first interesting was that their talk about AI originates from before the current hype around things like ChatGPT. So they have been discussing it for a while now. In terms of their engagement, though, this is a very preliminary stage, which perhaps gives us a good opportunity maybe to get ahead of the curve in terms of PCVE and CVE on this. And in terms of the total posts, I would say but maybe 1 or 2% of the corpus of the whole entirety of their discussions are kind of devoted to this. It's a very kind of peripheral issue for these groups, but they have been increasingly talking about it. So in terms of their appraisals, there are only very few positive appraisals of AI, mainly as a form of kind of community building. At the bottom right-hand side of this slide, there's a kind of screen grab of an image generated by AI as part of a competition that Patriotic Alternative did earlier in the year. They often use this red squirrel symbol because red squirrels are endangered and they think the white race is endangered. So that's the kind of symbolism behind that. And then what was quite interesting was that most of the posts weren't kind of necessarily connected to their core ideological concerns about immigration, anti-Semitism, or Islamophobia. It was actually mainly around this idea of a conspiracy by elites to kind of replace humans, to kind of replace the kind of ideological agenda to a more liberal kind of mainstream one. And it's kind of an extension and long tail effect of some of their kind of anti-government, anti-vax type narratives, and this idea of kind of the desperation of humanity through artificial means and through kind of a global nefarious elite. There weren't any evidence that I could find in terms of use for kinetic attacks, but I have to say that these groups are largely kind of non-violent in nature, so that's perhaps not surprising. And then finally, in terms of some key conclusions, this kind of suggests that there is a kind of opportunistic pragmatism around how these groups talk about AI in order to kind of seize on wedge issues around. They talked, for example, about gender fluidity and how talking to AI, how that kind of broaches discussion there. They also kind of stresses this malevolent creativity, so using new and emerging means of tech in order to really kind of see what they can exploit, and also emerging anti-liberal, anti-elite narratives that a lot of these groups are kind of jumping on in order to further their appeals. So in terms of just finally to wrap up recommendations, I think there needs to be kind of a greater amount of research around the scale of this issue. Hope to do more, a bit more substantive study in the future, mainly perhaps comparing violent and non-violent groups. Also more research in terms of testing perhaps, or kind of blue teaming around how AI can be used within CVE, PCV as well, and also kind of more research on the real world threats. A lot of these groups are largely experimenting with this at the early phases, so that adds a responsibility on us as researchers and practitioners to see how we can get ahead of the curve. So that's it in terms of my comments. I'll cede the floor back to Maddie and look forward to the other presentations. Thank you very much.